Lower Manhattan, New York, Federal Plaza, Thursday morning, January 13, 1972. The offices of the Drug Enforcement Administration, where federal agents spent their days tracking international drug trafficking organizations, building cases against major importers, coordinating with local police departments to dismantle the supply chains that brought heroin, cocaine, and marijuana into American cities. The fluorescent lights humming overhead. The desks covered in surveillance photographs and wiretap transcripts and reports from informants. The atmosphere thick with cigarette smoke and coffee, and the particular tension that comes from hunting dangerous criminals who have unlimited money and no moral boundaries. And sitting in a small interrogation room on the 4th floor, talking to DEA Special Agent Michael Richardson, was Detective First Grade Anthony Marconi of the New York Police Department's Special Investigations Unit. Marconi, 39 years old, 18 years on the force, 12 years working narcotics, supposedly one of the NYPD's most dedicated and effective drug enforcement officers, a man who'd received commendations for his work, who'd made hundreds of arrests, who had a reputation for being tough and incorruptible and absolutely committed to getting drugs off New York's streets. Marconi was also, at that exact moment, carrying in his coat pocket an envelope containing $15,000 in cash, payment from Frank Lucas. The third payment Marconi had received that month. Money that Frank Lucas paid to ensure that Detective Marconi and 5 other officers in his unit would ignore Frank's heroin operation, would decline to investigate reports about Frank's activities, would actively warn Frank if any other law enforcement agencies started looking at him, would essentially function as Frank's personal protection service within the NYPD. And Special Agent Richardson, who was sitting across from Marconi discussing a joint NYPD-DEA operation targeting major heroin distributors in Harlem, had absolutely no idea that the detective he was talking to was being paid by the very criminals they were supposed to be investigating. Richardson trusted Marconi. The DEA trusted the NYPD's Special Investigations Unit. They shared intelligence, coordinated raids, worked together on cases because everyone believed they were on the same side, fighting the same war against the same enemy. They weren't. At least 6 officers in the Special Investigations Unit, including Detective Marconi, were working for Frank Lucas. And Frank was also paying 3 DEA agents, 2 supervisors in the NYPD's Narcotics Division, 4 uniformed officers who worked in Harlem and could provide early warning of police activity, 1 assistant district attorney who could make charging decisions, and 2 judges who could influence bail and sentencing. Frank Lucas, in January 1972, had corrupted at least 18 different people across multiple law enforcement and judicial agencies. He was paying approximately $250,000 per month in bribes, protection money, and what he called insurance premiums to ensure that his heroin operation could function without interference from the very agencies whose job was to destroy organizations exactly like his. And the truly remarkable thing, the detail that made Frank's corruption network both brilliant and ultimately unsustainable, was that most of these corrupted officials didn't know about each other. The NYPD detectives didn't know Frank was also paying DEA agents. The DEA agents didn't know Frank was paying NYPD supervisors. The judges didn't know about the assistant district attorney. Frank had compartmentalized his corruption network so effectively that each corrupted official believed they were the only one, or possibly one of 2 or 3, and none of them understood the full scope of how many people Frank had bought, how much money he was spending, how completely he'd penetrated the law enforcement infrastructure that was supposed to be stopping him. This compartmentalization was intentional. Frank understood that corruption networks fail when the corrupted officials start talking to each other, start comparing notes, start realizing how much money is being distributed, and start demanding bigger shares. Keep everyone separated, keep everyone thinking they're special, keep everyone believing they have a unique relationship with you, and they stay loyal and quiet and useful. Let them figure out how many other people you're paying, and they start getting greedy or nervous or both, and the whole system collapses. But by January 1972, Frank Lucas's corruption network was starting to show cracks. Small cracks, barely visible, the kind of structural weaknesses that wouldn't be obvious until the entire system collapsed and people looked back and wondered how they'd missed the warning signs. Because maintaining corruption on this scale, paying 18 different officials across multiple agencies, keeping everyone separated and quiet and loyal, required constant attention and perfect execution, and the kind of luck that never lasts forever. The first crack appeared 3 weeks earlier, December 1971, when DEA Special Agent Robert Chen received his monthly payment from Frank Lucas and noticed it was $2,000 less than usual. Chen had been receiving $8,000 per month for approximately 18 months, accepting cash in exchange for providing Frank with information about DEA investigations, warning Frank when his name came up in agency discussions, making sure that reports about Frank's activity somehow got lost or deprioritized or transferred to other agents who weren't being paid to ignore them. It was a comfortable arrangement. Chen made $18,000 per year as a federal agent. The extra $8,000 per month from Frank Lucas, $96,000 per year, allowed him to live like someone making 5 times his official salary. But the December payment was only $6,000. And when Chen contacted his intermediary, a mid-level member of Frank's organization, who handled the actual cash transfers to avoid direct contact between Frank and the corrupted officials, Chen was told that payments were being reduced across the board because Frank was having cash flow issues and needed everyone to accept temporary reductions until business improved. Cash flow issues. Frank Lucas, the man who was reportedly generating over $1 million per day in heroin revenue, was claiming to have cash flow issues. Chen didn't believe it. And his suspicion immediately went to the most logical explanation. Frank was reducing payments because he'd found cheaper officials to corrupt, or because he was planning to phase out his current corruption network in favor of a new group of officials who didn't know what the previous rates were, or because something had changed in Frank's operation that made the old arrangements less valuable. Whatever the reason, Chen didn't appreciate having his payments reduced without consultation, without explanation, without even the courtesy of Frank reaching out personally to discuss it. Chen had been risking his career, risking federal prison, risking everything for this money. And now Frank was treating him like an expense to be cut when things got tight. That created resentment. And resentment in corrupted officials is dangerous because resentment makes people start thinking about alternatives, about whether they might be better off cooperating with law enforcement and testifying against the person who'd been paying them, rather than continuing to protect someone who apparently didn't value their service anymore. The second crack appeared in early January 1972, when Detective Marconi learned from one of his NYPD colleagues, also on Frank's payroll, that Frank had been making payments to at least 3 other officers in their unit that neither Marconi nor his colleague had known about. This was a violation of their understanding with Frank. When Marconi had first agreed to accept money from Frank in 1970, Frank had assured him that only 1 or 2 other officers would be involved, that the corruption would be limited and careful and controlled. Learning that there were at least 5 other officers being paid, possibly more, made Marconi realize that Frank had been lying to him for 2 years, that the exclusive arrangement he thought he had was actually a widespread network that included potentially dozens of people. This revelation bothered Marconi for several reasons. First, the more people involved, the higher the risk that someone would get caught, or would flip and start cooperating with investigators, which could expose everyone else in the network. Second, if Frank was paying 5 or 6 officers in Marconi's unit alone, he was probably paying dozens of officials across multiple agencies, which meant the total amount Frank was spending on corruption was enormous, which meant Marconi's $15,000 per month was probably a small percentage of what Frank was distributing, which meant Marconi was being underpaid for the risks he was taking. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Marconi realized that Frank had been manipulating him, had been managing their relationship not with honesty and trust, but with lies and compartmentalization designed to keep Marconi compliant and isolated. Marconi didn't immediately do anything with this information. He continued accepting payments, continued providing protection, continued warning Frank about investigations. But the trust was broken. And once trust breaks between a criminal and the officials he's corrupted, the relationship becomes transactional and fragile, and vulnerable to dissolution the moment either party decides the arrangement is no longer beneficial. The third crack appeared on January 13, 1972, during Detective Marconi's meeting with DEA Special Agent Richardson. They were discussing a joint operation targeting several major heroin distributors in Harlem. Richardson had surveillance photographs, wanted to show them to Marconi, wanted to get NYPD's input on identifying the individuals pictured, and understanding their roles in the distribution network. Standard interagency cooperation. Nothing unusual. Richardson spread 12 photographs across the table, and Marconi immediately recognized 4 of the people in those photographs. They were Frank Lucas's people, key members of Frank's organization. The photographs showed them making deliveries, meeting with street-level dealers handling what were obviously drug transactions. This meant the DEA was actively investigating Frank's operation. This meant Richardson and his team were building a case. This meant Frank's network of corrupted DEA agents, whoever they were, had failed to prevent or at least warn about this investigation. Marconi kept his expression neutral, didn't reveal any recognition of the people in the photographs. "Don't know them," he said, lying smoothly because that's what Frank paid him to do. "But I can ask around, see if any of my informants recognize these guys." Richardson nodded, satisfied with that response. "Good. We think these guys are connected to someone big, someone importing pure heroin directly from Southeast Asia. We don't have a name yet, don't have enough for a warrant, but we're getting close. If your people hear anything at all about major importers operating in Harlem, I want to know immediately." Marconi agreed, promised to share any information he developed, and left the meeting with his mind racing, because what he'd just learned was catastrophic for Frank Lucas. The DEA was actively investigating his organization. They had surveillance photographs of his key people. They were building a case. And most importantly, they were doing this investigation without Frank knowing about it, which meant Frank's corrupted DEA agents either didn't know about Richardson's investigation or weren't able to stop it, or had decided not to warn Frank for some reason. Marconi walked 6 blocks from Federal Plaza to a payphone on Worth Street, called a number that connected him to one of Frank's intermediaries, and delivered a message. "The feds are actively investigating. They have photographs of 4 key people. They know about the pure heroin. They don't have a name yet, but they're close. Frank needs to know this immediately." The message reached Frank Lucas approximately 2 hours later, during a meeting at one of his Harlem properties where he was reviewing the previous week's revenue numbers with his brother and several cousins who helped manage the distribution network. Frank's first reaction was anger. He was paying 3 DEA agents specifically to prevent exactly this kind of surprise investigation. How had the DEA been conducting surveillance and gathering evidence without any of his paid agents warning him? Either his agents didn't know about the investigation, which meant they weren't as well positioned as they'd claimed, or they knew and hadn't warned him, which meant they'd decided to stop protecting him. Either way, Frank's corruption network had failed its primary function, early warning of law enforcement activity, and that failure revealed a fundamental problem with Frank's entire approach to corruption. He'd built an extensive network, had paid enormous amounts of money, had corrupted officials across multiple agencies, but he'd done it without sufficient redundancy and without adequate verification. He'd trusted that the people he was paying would actually protect him. He'd assumed that money created loyalty, and now he was discovering that corrupted officials are fundamentally unreliable because their loyalty is transactional and temporary and only lasts as long as the money keeps flowing and as long as they believe the relationship benefits them more than cooperating with law enforcement would. Frank called an emergency meeting of his top associates, not at any of his usual locations, too risky if the DEA was conducting surveillance. Instead, they met at a neutral site, a friend's apartment in the Bronx, somewhere that wouldn't be connected to Frank's operation. 7 people attended: Frank, his 4 brothers who handled different aspects of the business, and 2 trusted associates who'd been with Frank since the beginning. "We've got a problem," Frank began, his voice tense in a way his brothers rarely heard. "The DEA is investigating us. They have photographs of our people making deliveries. They know about the pure heroin. They don't have my name yet, but they're building a case and eventually they'll figure out who's running things." His youngest brother, Terrence, asked the obvious question. "What about the feds you're paying? Why didn't they warn us about this?" "Good question," Frank said, "and I don't have a good answer. Either they don't know about this investigation, which means the DEA has internal teams working independently, or they know and didn't tell us, which means they've decided to stop protecting us. Either way, we can't trust them anymore." Frank's older brother, Monroe, who handled security for the organization, raised another concern. "What about the cops you're paying? Are they still reliable? Or are we about to get hit from multiple directions at once?" Frank had been thinking about that exact question since receiving Marconi's warning. The cops are still providing information, still warning us about investigations, but I'm not confident about their long-term loyalty. I've been hearing complaints about payments, about other officers being involved, about people wanting more money or better terms. The whole corruption system is getting unstable. This admission created uncomfortable silence in the room. Because if Frank's corruption network was failing, if the law enforcement officials he'd been paying for years were becoming unreliable or actively betraying him, then the entire operation was vulnerable. Frank's heroin business generated enormous revenue, but it also depended on protection from law enforcement. Without that protection, without early warnings about investigations and raids, without corrupted officials making evidence disappear and cases fall apart, Frank's organization would be exposed to the full force of federal and local drug enforcement efforts. So what do we do? Terrence asked. Do we try to fix the corruption network? Pay more money? Bring in more officials? Rebuild the protection? Frank shook his head. No, that's throwing good money after bad. The problem isn't the amount we're paying. The problem is that corruption networks are inherently unstable. People get greedy, people get nervous, people start calculating whether they're better off cooperating with investigators than continuing to protect us. We've been lucky for 4 years, but luck runs out, and I think ours is running out now. Then what's the alternative? Monroe asked. If we can't trust the corrupted officials, if we can't maintain protection, how do we operate? How do we avoid getting arrested? Frank didn't have a good answer to that question. The truth was that there wasn't a sustainable alternative. Every major drug operation eventually got caught because perfect security was impossible. You could delay arrest through careful operations, through corruption, through luck, but eventually law enforcement accumulated enough evidence, or found enough cooperating witnesses, or just got lucky with a surveillance operation, and your organization fell apart. The question was never if you'd get caught. The question was how long you could delay the inevitable. We need to start preparing for the end, Frank finally said. We need to move money offshore where the government can't seize it. We need to create legitimate business fronts that can explain some of our wealth. We need to reduce our profile, stop showing off, stop giving law enforcement reasons to prioritize investigating us. And we need to be ready for the possibility that this all comes crashing down in the next 6 months or year or however long we have left. This was not what his brothers wanted to hear. They'd gotten used to the money, the lifestyle, the power that came from running one of the largest heroin operations in New York. The idea of scaling back, of preparing for arrest and conviction, of accepting that their time might be limited, contradicted everything they'd believed about their own invincibility. But Frank had become increasingly realistic about the sustainability of his operation. He'd spent 4 years building an empire, generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue, living like a millionaire, believing he was smarter than everyone who'd tried and failed before him. And now, in January 1972, he was beginning to understand that he wasn't smarter. He'd just been luckier. And luck was a terrible foundation for a criminal enterprise because luck always ran out eventually. The meeting ended without any clear resolution. Frank's brothers left understanding that the situation was more serious than they'd realized, that the corruption network they'd depended on was failing, that law enforcement was closing in from multiple directions. But none of them, including Frank, were ready to actually shut down the operation and walk away while they still could. The money was too good. The lifestyle was too appealing. The ego investment in proving they could succeed where others had failed was too strong. So they continued operating. Frank continued paying his corrupted officials even though he no longer fully trusted them. He continued importing heroin from Thailand, continued distributing it throughout New York and New Jersey, continued generating approximately $1 million per day in revenue. But he did make some changes. He reduced his public profile, stopped driving the $300,000 Rolls-Royce everywhere, stopped attending high-profile events where he might be photographed. He began moving money offshore more aggressively, transferring funds to Swiss bank accounts and Caribbean financial institutions where U.S. authorities would have difficulty seizing them. He established legitimate business fronts, car washes and dry cleaners and small retail operations that could theoretically explain some of his wealth if questioned. But these were defensive measures, preparations for eventual arrest rather than strategies that would prevent arrest. Because Frank understood, even if he didn't admit it to his brothers or his associates, that the question was no longer whether he'd be caught but when. The DEA investigation would continue. Eventually they'd identify him as the head of the organization. Eventually, they'd accumulate enough evidence for warrants and arrests. Eventually, one of his corrupted officials would decide that cooperating with law enforcement offered better prospects than continuing to protect a criminal whose operation was obviously collapsing. The corruption network continued to deteriorate throughout 1972. More officials complained about payments. More people wanted more money or threatened to stop providing protection. More information leaked about how many people Frank was paying, which created resentment and distrust within the network. DEA Special Agent Chen, whose payments had been reduced in December 1971, began quietly cooperating with his agency's Internal Affairs Division, providing information about corruption within the DEA without specifically naming himself as one of the corrupted agents yet, testing the waters to see whether cooperation might be a better option than continued participation in Frank's network. Detective Marconi continued providing warnings to Frank throughout 1972, but his reports became less reliable, his information less current, his overall value declining as his own position within the NYPD became more precarious. By late 1972, Marconi was under internal investigation himself, suspected of having relationships with drug dealers, suspected of accepting bribes, suspected of being exactly what he was, a corrupted official working for the criminals he was supposed to be arresting. Frank's payments to corrupted officials reached their peak in mid-1972, approximately $350,000 per month, distributed to at least 22 different people across law enforcement and judicial agencies. But the value Frank received from these payments was declining rapidly. The warnings were less frequent, less accurate, less useful. The protection was less reliable. The sense that Frank could operate with impunity, that his corrupted officials would keep him safe from investigation and prosecution, was evaporating as the network became increasingly unstable and increasingly penetrated by law enforcement's own anti-corruption efforts. By December 1972, exactly 1 year after DEA Special Agent Chen's payments had first been reduced, Frank's corruption network was barely functioning. Several corrupted officials had stopped providing information entirely, either because they were under investigation themselves or because they decided the risk was no longer worth the money. Others were providing information so general and so delayed that it had no practical value. A few were actively cooperating with law enforcement anti-corruption investigations, providing names and details and evidence about Frank's bribery operations in exchange for immunity or reduced charges. And Detective Richie Roberts, the NYPD officer who would eventually arrest Frank Lucas, was conducting his own investigation, completely outside Frank's corrupted network. Roberts wasn't being paid by Frank, wasn't part of the Special Investigations Unit where most of Frank's corrupted NYPD officers worked, wasn't vulnerable to the bribes and threats that had neutralized other investigators. Roberts was building his case carefully, methodically, without any of Frank's paid informants warning him that this investigation was happening. The question that everyone in New York's law enforcement community would later ask was simple. How did Frank Lucas maintain his corruption network for as long as he did? How did he pay off NYPD and DEA at the same time for years without anyone noticing or without the system collapsing sooner? The answer was a combination of factors. Careful compartmentalization that kept corrupted officials from knowing about each other, enormous amounts of money that made cooperation attractive, genuine fear among some officials that Frank would kill them or their families if they betrayed him, and simple institutional dysfunction that prevented law enforcement agencies from effectively monitoring their own people for corruption. But the more important question was, how long could it last? And the answer, visible in retrospect even if it wasn't obvious in January 1972, was not much longer. Corruption networks are inherently unstable. They depend on perfect secrecy, absolute loyalty, and continued belief among the corrupted officials that the benefits outweigh the risks. Break any one of those requirements, and the network begins to fail. Break multiple requirements simultaneously, which is what happened to Frank's network in 1972, and the collapse becomes inevitable. Frank Lucas was arrested on January 28, 1975. Approximately 3 years after that Thursday morning in January 1972, when Detective Marconi sat in a DEA office with $15,000 of Frank's money in his pocket, while discussing investigations into the very organization that was paying him. The investigation that led to Frank's arrest was conducted primarily by Detective Richie Roberts and federal prosecutors, who operated completely outside the corrupted network Frank had spent years and millions of dollars building. The corrupted officials Frank had paid provided almost no value during the final 18 months of his operation. Some were arrested themselves as law enforcement anti-corruption efforts identified and prosecuted dirty cops and agents. Others simply stopped taking Frank's money once they realized the protection they were offering was illusory, and the risk of continued participation was becoming catastrophic. Of the approximately 22 officials Frank was paying in mid-1972, only 3 were still providing any useful information by late 1974. The corruption network that Frank had believed made him untouchable had essentially ceased to exist. And when Frank was finally arrested, when federal agents raided his home and his businesses and seized his cash and his heroin and his records, none of the officials he'd paid for years lifted a finger to help him. None of them warned him the raids were coming. None of them made evidence disappear. None of them demonstrated any loyalty to the man who'd paid them hundreds of thousands of dollars over multiple years. Because that's the fundamental truth about corruption. It creates relationships based on money rather than loyalty. And relationships based on money end the moment the money stops providing value to both parties. Frank Lucas learned that lesson in the most expensive way possible. He spent approximately $8 million on corruption between 1969 and 1974, paid off some of the most powerful positions in New York law enforcement, believed he'd built an impenetrable network of protection that would keep him safe from investigation and prosecution. And when he needed that protection most, when federal agents were preparing to arrest him and dismantle his organization, the network he'd paid millions to build provided nothing. No warnings, no protection, no loyalty. Just corrupted officials calculating that their own survival depended on abandoning Frank Lucas and pretending they'd never accepted his money in the first place. January 13, 1972, Lower Manhattan. Detective Marconi sitting with DEA Special Agent Richardson, discussing heroin investigations while carrying Frank's money in his pocket. The moment when the cracks in Frank's corruption network were already visible, already growing, already signaling that the whole system would collapse long before Frank understood what was happening. The question wasn't whether the corruption could last. The question was only how much longer before everything fell apart. And the answer, though Frank didn't know it yet, was approximately 3 years. 3 years before arrest. 3 years before conviction. 3 years before Frank Lucas discovered that buying off NYPD and DEA simultaneously didn't make him untouchable. It just made him a more valuable target once law enforcement finally came for him, with investigators who couldn't be bought, and witnesses who decided cooperation was more valuable than loyalty to a criminal whose empire was already crumbling. The corruption network that was supposed to protect Frank Lucas became evidence used to prosecute him. The officials he'd paid testified against him. The receipts and records of payments became exhibits at his trial. The thing he'd thought was his greatest strength, his ability to corrupt law enforcement, became his greatest weakness, proof of his guilt. Demonstration that he'd been so successful and so wealthy that he could afford to buy police officers and federal agents and judges. And juries, when presented with evidence of that level of corruption, don't see a clever businessman. They see a criminal so dangerous, so wealthy, so powerful, that he corrupted the very institutions supposed to protect society from people like him, and they convict, every time, without hesitation, sending people like Frank Lucas to prison for 70 years and feeling good about it, because someone who can corrupt that many officials clearly deserves to spend the rest of their life behind bars. How long could it last? Not long enough. Never long enough. That's the answer Frank Lucas learned too late, sitting in federal prison, thinking about all the money he'd spent on protection that provided nothing, all the officials he'd trusted who'd betrayed him, all the years he'd believed he was smarter than everyone who'd tried and failed before him. The corruption network that was supposed to make him invincible had just made him more vulnerable, more exposed, more certain to be caught and convicted, when law enforcement finally came for him with agents who couldn't be bought and evidence that couldn't be buried. January 1972. The beginning of the end. The moment when Frank's greatest strength started becoming his fatal weakness. The moment when the question changed from whether he'd be caught to how much longer he had before everything collapsed. 3 years. That's how long it lasted after the cracks appeared. 3 years before federal agents knocked on his door and ended everything he'd built. 3 years during which Frank continued paying officials who'd stopped protecting him, continued trusting a network that had already failed, continued believing he could corrupt his way to safety, while law enforcement closed in from directions he couldn't see and couldn't buy his way out of. 3 years. And then 70 years in federal prison. That's how long it lasted. That's what Frank Lucas bought with $8 million in corruption payments. 3 years of false security and a lifetime of regret.